Thank you for joining me today, and I'm blessed to have as my guest Chris O'Leary. I've been wanting to talk with Chris for quite a long time. Any of you have followed my podcast over the last few years, I have interviewed quite a few survivors of priest abuse. Um, I think consciously I've made the decision at this point maybe to not do that anymore. It's difficult for me to talk about this subject. And I actually really hate asking survivors to tell their story yet again. Um, and I kind of wonder at this point, what's the purpose? I mean, so gosh, we're 20 years out of 2001.
Well, let me just say, there are different initiatives out there wanting to talk about survivors, and my question is always, what's the point? Because I get some people who want to talk about survivors, but it's like they're not doing anything with it, and it starts to feel like pornography. Are you just recording this so people can get off on this? So you can get off on the stories? I know that's not your purpose, but there are people out there, so I share the reticence and the reluctance.
Yeah, and I mean, I think as survivors, I think we've wanted to talk. I think the hierarchy is a lost cause, but
Agreed.
And I think the presbyterate is a lost cause too. So
yeah,
I think
too many enablers.
Yeah, so I think primarily what survivors have tried to do is speak to lay Catholics. But recently, in response to a video that I posted a few months ago where I talked to another survivor, I had a really interesting comment from a viewer, and they said that I believe I'm mangling what they said much more eloquently, but they said that I believe the laity essentially blames the victims for the pre-sex abuse scandal. And I thought about that, and I really thought about it, and I just thought about it for a few days, and I go, I think they're right. I think they might not say it, but I think subconsciously the laity is like, I wish these people would just go away.
Right, absolutely.
Because they're reminding me of something I don't want to be reminded of, or they're reminding me of something that I really don't want to know about.
Right. They're trying to tell me something I don't know. This is classic cognitive dissonance. If you don't believe in cognitive dissonance, study the Catholic sex abuse crisis, because that's exactly what it is. And it drives me crazy. My friends on Facebook, many of whom are female, who they won't engage with this stuff. And that's even all the more scary, because these are women who have kids, and now they're having grandkids, and nobody's doing anything because nobody wants to believe it.
And I think people, I used this line, or I mentioned this line this quotation when I interviewed Elizabeth Yore in 2004. Wilton Gregory, who at the time of the Boston scandal, was in charge of the USCCB, and now he's Archbishop of Washington, D.C.
He said, and he's from my neck of the woods. He gained prominence from my neck of the woods. He's across the river from me in Belleville.
Why is that? So he said the scandal is history.
Right.
And I think a lot of lay Catholics want to believe that. I think they want to believe that it's something that happened.
Well, and there's even worse. There's another survivor. I didn't hear this quote, but Gregory apparently once characterized this as drama. And he said it exactly like that in his way. If you know how he speaks, you can hear him saying drama. Well, it's not drama to a survivor. And it's a very clear and present danger to children, as we speak and as we sit.
Yeah. I wanted to say I didn't want to, stop. I don't want to say stop, but I didn't want to put a hiatus on speaking to survivors until I spoke to you because I wanted, like I said, I wanted to speak to you for a long time. I first heard your name from Gene Gamulka, and people can go back in my podcast and listen to the interview I did with him. He's, I guess, I don't know what you, I don't know if he's still a priest. He's a former priest, I guess you could say, Catholic priest. And
Yeah, he's kind of in the Tom Doyle category.
I don't know what to say. I mean, he married and has children and is living a good life. And he's I would say is an expert on the pre-sex abuse scandal. And he mentioned you, and then I found you on Twitter, and I watched for a long time, and I thought, wow, this guy, referring to you, I thought this guy's really fearless because you go out there. I mean, I'm serious. You go out there, and I don't think I could do that. You go out there and confront I don't know how else to say it. You go out there and confront the church and ask them the tough questions. And I tried to do that for a couple of years, and I don't mean to sound melodramatic, but I found that to be almost as traumatizing as the abuse, to talk to these people again. And I think you've kind of described it in a good way. And I think recently, I think you had this experience too, when trying to confront the church, is that there's a strange lack of empathy, but even deeper than that, there's a strange lack of emotion. And I'm a kind of a Star Trek fan, so it's kind of like talking to a Vulcan. There's just a very blank face there that when you finally are speaking to a bishop, and I've spoken to several, and even some priests, and then you say, well, I'm a pre-sex abuse survivor, it's very eerie. I don't know. And I think you've encountered that a lot, more than most.
Yeah, I spoke to my Archbishop Carlson. I tried to meet with my current Archbishop Rosansky, but he refused to meet with me. Well, and and maybe I'm just crazy enough. I've got enough ego. I'm smart enough that people don't intimidate me. But one of the things is the presence of my friend, the Cardinal, in my story. So I've actually got 5 cardinals, and not the baseball kind, involved and implicated in my story, including one who I grew up with and is one of my earliest memories as a child. My first memory of a priest is a cardinal of the Catholic Church now. So I knew him when he was just Father whatever. And that is Timothy Cardinal Dolan, the Archbishop of New York. So I've known Dolan from back in the day, when he was a guy straight out of the seminary, kind of waddling around the school, and, nice guy, easy to serve for, not a hisser. Monsignor Flavin would hiss at us if we did anything wrong. Father Dolan was much more forgiving and kind of, attaboyish and friendly and everything. But the problem is that, and to a degree, my story is the answer to the question of what happened after Spotlight. So you've got the movie Spotlight and the events characterized in that, and then it finishes with this big dramatic scene and the publication of the original articles in early January 2002. My story is the answer to the question of what happened next, and that involves, at the time, Auxiliary Bishop and now Cardinal Timothy Dolan. And I know him. I know who he is. I know what he is. I know what he's like. And I also have Regali and Burke and O'Malley, and all my abuse happened under Carberry. So I have enough cardinals involved in my story that I really kind of see through them. And I remember I met Carberry when I was a child, and I remember having to memorize this whole speech, and I didn't really get the whole deal, but I just know how nervous, I'm like this little kid, and they tell me to do this little speech, and I had to say, Your Eminence, and I couldn't get Your Eminence right because I'm like a first grader or something, and the adults were so nervous, and I'm like, what is the deal? What's, this guy, he dresses kind of fabulously, but, he's just a guy. Come on. But, maybe I'm lucky or cursed enough to have that level of arrogance, but I guess it's helped me. And, I certainly have seen through Dolan. He's done the whole thing to me. And So I know what they're like. I know who they are. I know what they are.
Okay, here's the question I hate to ask, but could you tell a little bit about your story? I mean, and because I
Yeah.
think people won't be familiar. Some people won't be. I know people that you've been on Church Militant, so people that watch that. Um,
And I was on the news last night with my showdown battering ram at the outside the Cathedral Basilica of the Archdiocese of St. Louis.
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, where that was. I would regard that as blasphemous or sacrilegious, what they did. And what was funny is the seminarians seem to regard it that way, but the rector, the Monsignor, he had a different view of things. So let me tell my story. So I was sexually exploited, abused, assaulted over the course of 4 years at the Church of the Immaculata in Richmond Heights, Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis, just up the hill from the Galleria, if you know St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
Then Father, now Cardinal Timothy Dolan, overlapped with my abuser, Father Leroy Valentine, for 2 years from the summer of 77 to the summer of 79. And I should say this is a really horrible time of the year for me, because this is when the worst stuff happened. I don't want to get too much into the abuse, but essentially what would happen is during the middle of the summer, after the old people's mass, he would bring you up. He would bring me up, and I thought it was the only one he did this with, but apparently he did it with a bunch of guys. He would bring us up individually to serve with him, and then afterwards we would go through what I describe as special training. And well, and since your audience is a little more faithful, I'll make this point. He taught me how to consecrate the host. He gave me the power of consecration. No, we didn't. But that's how he distracted me, is we went through this whole ritual where he taught me the consecration prayer, and I knew enough to know that if I'm dealing with consecrated hosts versus unconsecrated hosts, that's a huge difference, and that's how he distracted me. So that happened for about 4 years. Dolan overlapped with Valentine for 2 years at Immaculata. They lived in the same rectory with Monsignor Flavin. Dolan knew at least some of what was going on, because part of Valentine's process is Valentine would bring guys up to his room in the rectory and would test us and groom us in Valentine's room. And this is in the same upstairs as where Father Dolan lived. People have told me, oh, but maybe Dolan just didn't know. Over the course of 2 years, given what Valentine was doing, Dolan knew what was going on. And I know other people who have said, now I can't get these people to say anything publicly because everybody's seen what's been happening to me. I've been completely terrorized, and they're running a smear campaign, and they've called the cops on me on everything. But so that went on for 4 years, from 77 to 81. I was actually exploited and abused again in high school, my Jesuit high school, St. Louis University High School. It started in the locker room, which was unsupervised. And there were various Jesuits, some who liked the younger boys, some who liked the older boys. And then things got really bad. So in 2002, January 2002, the Spotlight articles run. That then leads the New York Times somehow. The New York Times somehow ends up in my backyard doing a piece comparing the response of the Archdiocese of St. Louis to the Archdiocese of Belleville. And Gregory was running Belleville at the time. And they named Father Leroy Valentine in that New York Times piece. The piece is called "Too Past, No Easy Solution on Abusive Priests." So in the aftermath of that, the St. Louis Press picked that up. I ended up calling the circuit attorney, who didn't do anything, I assume because of statute of limitations reasons. I heard something about a grand jury. They never called me back. Nothing ever happened from that call. I did call the press, KSDK. I talked to a reporter. She wanted me to talk on air. And I'm like, I don't know what I got. I got a lot of stuff. And really, and the thing is, and I should say this, I remembered like 95% of it. I didn't remember the worst stuff because he Cosby'd me. So like the memory of the worst day picks up with me in the basement of the rectory, bailing out of the rectory, and I end up underneath a tree and my ass feels like it's on fire.
What do you
can
mean?
imagine.
What do you mean Cosby? You mean drug use?
Okay. So this is the 70s. And I had two brothers. So when we would get a soda, I would have to split a soda among my two brothers. So I'd have to split it three ways. And we weren't getting Coca-Cola, we were getting Vess or RC Cola. But when you went to see Father Valentine, not only did you get Coca-Cola, but you got the whole can to yourself. Now, what was weird is that this Coca-Cola at the rectory tasted a little weird, a little different than the Coke you would get every now and again, I believe because he was drugging it.
Yeah.
Which is why I blank out for a lot of the worst stuff. And a lot of the worst stuff is just like, it's not video, it's more like flashes of photographs, and whatever is kind of a video kind of memory just kind of picks up with me in the basement of the rectory, that kind of thing. And that all happened like right now. So the worst stuff, the worst day, it was probably more than just one day. The worst stuff happened at this time of year. My parents would go to the Greenbrier for a conference, and we would have a babysitter, and invariably Father Valentine would call and say, hey, you want to come up and we'll do a special training session up in the sacristy after Mass. So I would serve the midweek Mass, the old people Mass, just me instead of there being two or three servers. And then stuff would happen after Mass in the sacristy. And again, I was distracted by the presence of a consecrated host. He would use a phony consecration ritual as a way of distracting me, because I knew enough about the importance of a consecrated host to know that if I'm dealing with a consecrated host, this is a big deal, and I have to be completely locked in on that task, which allowed him to, so I'm locked in on this total BS task, and he's doing stuff to me. And then that progressed to the worst stuff. So then 2002, the Spotlight reports run, the New York Times piece runs. I call the circuit attorney, I call KSDK, and I also call the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And lo and behold, my friend, Father, but by then Auxiliary Bishop Timothy Dolan, called me back. And I told him a set of 4 memories. This is early March 2002, just in the weeks after Spotlight, after weeks after the end of the movie Spotlight, weeks after the original Spotlight articles ran. And I talked to Dolan, I told him 4 memories, and he's like, and he told me verbatim. And I asked him, do you believe what they're saying about Father Valentine? He's like, no. I know that Father Valentine didn't do any of the things that he's accused of. I know that Leroy Valentine could never do anything to hurt a child. It was impossible. What they were saying about Father Valentine was impossible, which was good enough for me. So I actually went on with my life. And of course, then my abuse actually started. And so I should jump back and say my abuse started during face-to-face confession, during the sacrament of confession. Which again is a sacrilegious act and should lead to excommunication, which it did not. So that's kind of the gist of it. But so my older son makes his first confession, I have a panic attack. My older daughter makes her first confession, I have a panic attack. And I basically spent 10 years trying to figure out what the hell was wrong with me, because I had what in the back in the day would be called a nervous breakdown. And essentially what happened is then Bishop, now Cardinal Dolan, sent me on a 10-year wild goose chase by ruling out sexual abuse as a problem. So I spent tens of thousands of dollars on therapy trying to figure out what was going on. It wasn't until 2011 that working with a therapist, we figured out maybe there was something to this Father Valentine stuff. At which point I went back to the Archdiocese of St. Louis, spoke to a review team, and they immediately just said, no, there's nothing to this. They blamed it all on my father. And they actually had the gall to come back and say, well, we talked to Father Valentine, and Father Valentine said he didn't do it. So,
Case closed.
Right. And kind of the worst part and the most horrible part is in 2013, they ended up permanently removing Father Valentine, and they never contacted me or warned me that they were going to do that, much less helped me. And that's and be careful in terms of the Cardinals that you want to be a fan of. That started under Regali, who's slimy, but it also continued under Cardinal Burke. So Cardinal Burke is not spotless in terms of this stuff. And and I'm talking about the left and the right. Burke, Regali, Dolan, O'Malley. This is the whole political spectrum.
Yep.
Is covered by these Cardinals. So that's kind of the gist of it.
Yeah. I just had one question real quick.
Yeah.
When you originally talked to Dolan in I guess would you just say it was 2002?
Early March 2002.
Okay. Did you because you said you had recounted some memories. Were you telling him that you had been abused at that time?
No, I told him a bunch of memories that were questionable. I always thought of myself as one of Valentine's favorites. Father Valentine was one of my favorite priests, if not people. I only had one memory that was kind of questionable. I had a lot. The logic was I spent a lot of time with Father Valentine, including the special training stuff, and I was alone with Father Valentine. So I'm like, if Valentine did anything to anyone, he probably would have done it to me. The problem is that I didn't understand what he was doing to me was abuse. I simply didn't understand it. And a lot of my memories kind of faded out, in part because he was drugging me either with drugs or with alcohol. So kind of the worst stuff would fade out. So I would remember the precursor stuff and the afterward stuff. The only kind of during stuff I remember is we were coming back from a mud cave, and this is one of the pictures of me that you can find out on the internet. Me and a couple other guys were driving back from a mud cave, and I'm riding shotgun with Father Valentine. And I think what happened is that he was touching me when I was asleep, and I ended up waking up from that nap. And I told that to Dolan, and he's like, no, that doesn't mean anything. That's nothing. But I woke up from that nap and looked at Father Valentine, and he just looked disgusting to me. And one of my therapists has said that was a flash of insight. Even though I didn't know what was going on inside, I was starting to figure it out. Because by that time I was in 7th grade. A lot of this stuff started in 4th grade, and I was a naive kid, and I just didn't understand what was going on.
Yeah. I took a bunch of notes here while you were speaking. There's one aspect of your story that I want to focus on because I think it's representative, and I think it's also been a factor in some other well-known cases. Now Cardinal Dolan lived with, I don't know how else to say it, lived with your abuser.
Right. There was 3 priests living together in the top floor of the rectory at Immaculata, which is like a medium-sized house.
This has been the case with other high-profile cardinals. Okay, Cardinal Pell in Australia lived for quite a long time. I can't remember this priest's name, but he was the most prolific priest pedophile in Australian history. And he molested countless boys. And Pell, of course, although at the time a victim did come forward and tell Pell that he was being abused, later, when all this came to light, although Pell did accompany this priest to court, claimed that he didn't know anything about it.
Right.
And then, of course,
which I would argue that's how you get made in the Catholic Church. That's how you get into the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. In Mob's sense, that's getting made. You've demonstrated your ability to keep your mouth shut and put the church before people.
Yeah. And then probably the other famous case is Cardinal Farrell, who lived with Cardinal McCarrick for quite a while. And
no, I didn't know that. Farrell followed me for a while. I always wondered why Farrell was following me. He still may be following me. I wonder if that's for intel purposes.
Probably. And Farrell claimed to have known nothing about McCarrick. And I don't buy it, just because I've been in situations where I've worked with priests, and they know everything. It's a small world.
Right.
They're some of them tend to be very chatty and very gossipy, and priests just talk about bishops and they talk about the hierarchy and they all know everything, even if it's a rumor. So I don't
Right.
buy that these guys were living with serial predators and didn't know anything about it. And then so when you were talking about your story, I picked up on that. I go, oh, here's another case of didn't know anything, didn't know anything.
Right. It's not plausible. These are very smart men. It's not plausible. They're, it's absurd.
People believe it. And
Well,
then,
because they want to believe it. They don't want it to be true. And
no,
starting with Dolan, and that's part of the problem. I'm convinced that's part of the problem with my story is the involvement of Dolan. People love Dolan, and Dolan's the St. Louis guy who made good, and as a result, you have all this enabling by the attorneys general of Missouri, now Senator Josh Hawley, Senate candidate Eric Schmidt. There's all this enabling of the Archdiocese of St. Louis going on.
I believe it. Yet Dolan has always struck me as being creepy. There's something very forced about him, and to me, he just reminds me of a predator. There's something
Right.
very. I just want to stay away from him. He's too forward in
Right.
his in
And
his
to be clear, I don't know
personality.
of any. I don't know of any. Nobody has ever told me anything about primary abuse by Dolan. All that I know about Dolan is that he witnessed, at least in part, abuse that was happening in the rectory at Immaculata.
Yeah, but I think predators and enablers tend to act the same way. They're just there's a forced sort of friendliness about them until I have to say you confront them about something, and
Right.
then the masks change, So
Well,
the,
what kind of a person could abuse or turn a blind eye to the abuse of a child? Well, that's a sociopath. And it doesn't
exactly,
matter whether you're doing it or turning a blind eye to it. It takes a sociopath either way.
exactly. Um, Another part of your story that sounds all too familiar to me is that, and see, I've always kind of been ashamed to talk about this, and you don't, but um, see, I was abused as a boy, and then I was abused again, and I think people tend to, when they hear that, they're like, well, what was wrong with you? You at that point you must have wanted it, or something, because you'd been abused, you know, and you were abused again. And see, that happened to you. So when you said that, because I'm really interested in that phenomenon, because I've read a lot of research and I get it, because people, men or women, people who are sexually abused as children are much more likely to be abused later in life.
All right.
And I've tried to figure that out. I don't know if it's because the victim, or I should say the survivor, I think I think in my I'll just talk about my case, because I don't want to talk about anybody else. But in my case, I think I was susceptible to re-abuse because, in a strange way, I was very needy and for affirmation and for love. But
Well, and
I
I just as
and,
a point, and this is a common thing. My dad was trying to make partner at this point, which is part. All right, where was your dad? Well, my dad was working his ass off trying to make partner. So that's part of what, right? Exactly. That's part of what created the vulnerability, and these guys target boys who have that void. I was looking for physical affection, and that was how he got at people, was by hugging people, and that's how the whole thing started. That's how he tested you. That's how he groomed you, was looking for guys who had that hole for one reason or another.
and I wonder too sometimes if predators sense that, and that's why people are re-abused,
Right.
and as opposed to someone, and I didn't know this about your story because when I've talked, and I haven't talked to many female survivors, and I don't know many, but well, 80% of the victims in Roman Catholicism were boys and men, or young boy, teenage boys, and and prepubescent boys. So well, anyway, so they were male. They were male. So the story that keeps reoccurring with the survivors, yeah, is what you just said, is a lack of a fatherly figure in their life, and that was definitely me. So boys tend to latch on, or priests latch on to these boys, and that definitely happened to me. So predators can sense that these young men are vulnerable, and that's been a reoccurring theme.
Well, there's one thing that I'm trying to add to the literature is the concept of testing, because what my guy did is, so everybody talks about grooming. Well, before grooming, there's this process called testing, where essentially, and this is what happens. So
I
you
never
could
heard of
argue
that.
that every boy at Immaculata was tested and abused at least to a degree. Essentially, what would happen is he was into wrestling, and what he would do is, while he was wrestling with you, he would grab you down there. And whether you reacted to that was the test. If you just froze, you passed the test. If you threw him off you and threw him across the room, you failed the test, as one of my friends did. The guy in the number shirt from one of my pictures. People talk about grooming, but what predators do is, before they groom you, they first test you, and they're looking for these certain kind of people to test or not. Although my guy, I think, tested everybody. He didn't care what their family situation was. I think it worked because I think I passed the test in part because I had this kind of hole in my life because of my situation with my dad. But he was testing everybody. He was grabbing everybody down there.
I have never did. Where did you get this sort of theory? I've never heard of that.
No, that's a term that I've made up based off of what my abuser did. He tested everybody, but he didn't, you had to, in order to make it up to the room, to room for quote unquote haircuts, which is what some guy called it. And I do have this thing about my hair. In order to make it up to the room, you had to pass the test and either freeze or not react to his grabbing your balls.
You know what? Is it because you just opened up? Gosh, I paid a lot of money in therapy. You just opened up something for me, because I remember my abuser, and it was in the context of sports. He would engage with a lot of the boys in terms of like soccer.
Right.
And yeah, I think some of the more sporty boys would really engage with him, and where I didn't.
Right.
So that's really interesting. So.
Well, and I think another thing that I've found is that, I was very quiet. I was a thinker. I was very thinky. And I think he selected out those kinds of guys. I was not savvy. I was a late bloomer. I've talked about this, in the summer of '79 stuff was going on. And I was still trying to figure out how the hell Darth Vader could be Luke Skywalker's dad. How does that happen? So that's the kind of stuff I'm thinking about. I'm not thinking about girls and cars and all that kind of stuff.
No, I was not assertive as a boy at all. Cause I tell people that there's certain, I don't want to say qualifications, but there's certain things I think that mark sometimes boys out for abuse. And I think I had them all. I was very shy. I was alienated from my father. I didn't get along with my male peers very well. Right. And I was sort of questioning my sexuality. So all those things came together, and I was very susceptible to, especially with the priest that abused me. And I think people don't realize this about abusers, is they come off, and I mean initially, as very compassionate and very
Right,
sympathetic. And to someone who's really starving, like I was,
right,
sort of male affirmation, that was like, well, wow,
right, exactly.
somebody actually really cares.
And it's not just somebody, it's a priest who's like
Yeah.
next in line to God for you. Well, and I, in terms of my sexuality, I've talked about this some, and I'm trying to be open about it. Well, I've talked about this with Gene Gomulka. I fell in love with my third grade teacher, Miss Key, which did kind of lock in and establish my sexuality. I don't understand why she didn't wait for me to marry until I graduated from college, but apparently she did. She even had a fiance. She had the gall of having a fiance, but that actually did help me kind of understand and establish my sexuality, so that when this stuff happened in fourth grade, it just led to confusion. And now what it led to was a lot of gender confusion, where I didn't understand why a man would do this stuff that men only do to women. And that led to gender confusion and that kind of stuff. But, while I had gender confusion stuff, I've never been attracted to men, but that was very confusing. So where's this? Why do I have all this gender confusion stuff, but not this stuff that my gay friends have? And it was confusing as hell. But I would go back to that Miss Key thing and say, God, yeah, but you fell in love with your third grade teacher. This was a very normal experience. And then you ran across a pedophile, and he just kind of scrambled everything up.
Exactly. Probably one of the scariest realizations that I made when I don't identify as gay anymore, but when I did, is that a lot of my friends, and this was not, I didn't choose this to happen, because I wasn't Catholic. I didn't practice at all. But a lot of my friends were ex-Catholic, and a lot of them had sexual experiences when they were boys with priests. And I was
Right.
like, it was very common, very common.
Yeah,
And
that sure does seem to be a thing.
and a lot of them, and see, this is why it took me so long to figure out that I had been molested, because I considered it, well, he was kind of a nice priest that was trying to help me, even though I was a minor. And a lot of my friends had that same, I mean, that's the way they regarded it. And I was like, wow, that's not good. And so Catholics don't realize that this is much more common than they think, but especially men, and especially men who later identify as gay, don't come forward, because they don't regard it as molestation. Because I didn't for probably 20 years. I
Right.
didn't. I just didn't. I mean, I didn't feel like he had raped me or forced me, but I mean, the groom, that's where I have to bring in the word grooming. I think he did such a good job of grooming, is that I believe that I was complicit in my own abuse.
Right. Well, and I was, and to a degree, I was lucky enough to fall in love with my third grade teacher, where that just kind of established it for me, and it kind of locked it in for me. Not everyone had that. Not everyone had that experience. That was just so definitive for me that I could go back on that. And this is like, this is like 20 years after my abuse. I could go back to that experience and say, no, but dude, you fell in love with Miss Key,
and, and
this is very different than the stories that my gay friends tell.
And I think straight male survivors are even more reticent to come forward, because,
Right,
of course, people are going to think they're gay.
right. No,
So,
and I had, so I remember when I started to not feel as shame about this. So one of the great contemporary American philosophers, Madonna, has a song,
yes,
What It Feels Like for a Girl, which was released when I think it was released when I had moved back to St. Louis, and there's a line in there. It says, "You think it's humiliating to dress like a girl because you think it's humiliating to be a girl." I'm like, well, I don't think that. I've got all my best friends are women, or a lot of my best friends are women, and I've got a girlfriend who I ended up marrying, and that helped remove a lot of the shame that I felt about the gender confusion stuff, and made it kind of less. It allowed me to be less compulsive about it and more thoughtful about it. But it was still 20 years before I was able to kind of work out those feelings and realize that there was a connection between the gender confusion stuff and the abuse stuff. And Cardinal Dolan didn't help at all with this wild goose chase stuff. He basically added another 10 years to that time frame, where I was mistaking confusion as a result of what Father Valentine did to me for trans kind of stuff. And I do believe that there are some real trans people who are, their brain doesn't match up with their bodies. But I have real concerns with a lot of this rapid trans, let's give them hormones without therapy kind of stuff, because I'm afraid that there are people like me who are confusing, who are confusing abuse, post-abuse experience with trans stuff. Yep. And some of the trans regret stuff actually helped me, because you get these guys who transition and they're like, and I ended up just being a guy trapped in a woman's body, because that wasn't what was going on. And now I haven't heard that those stories necessarily tie back to abuse, but I can pretty much guarantee that that's what would have happened in my case had I transitioned. Because fundamentally, again, I fell in love with my third grade teacher, Miss Key. All this other gender confusion stuff was just related to Father Valentine. And, and I had, the last dress I bought was, as my most recent therapist said, it's as close to a cassock as I could have bought without going into Catholic Supply. And of course I couldn't have gone into Catholic Supply, because that would have triggered the hell out of me. But I was buying dresses to recreate my abuse process.
This is also very fundamental too, because I was abused twice. Once as a prepubescent boy, it was in the bathroom, the restroom, the public restroom, and then the second time was in a car, and later, when I identified as gay, I repeatedly would have sex with strangers in public lavatories and in cars. I didn't think a thing about it. I didn't think.
And I know some people who are just like gay, but then there's this other stuff that's like compulsive, and I'm like, ooh,
that was me.
Right.
I couldn't figure out, because you just talked about repeating the abuse. I couldn't.
I call it reenactments.
Thank you. That's better. I was reenacting it over and over again.
Right.
And trying, I guess, in a sick way, trying to make it seem okay, and it just made it worse.
Right.
It just made it worse.
Because it's compulsive and it takes you over and it's consuming and you don't understand and it's scary. And, and again, I'm making this distinction between, there are some people I believe who are just gay. And there are some people who are trans. But there's this whole kind of middle thing. And my concern with kind of the present moment is there's a lot of enabling going on. And there are these people who have this kind of abuse stuff. And, there could be 1 million Catholic survivors in the United States, just males alone. Do we really want to be really aggressive with this trans stuff, with this rapid trans stuff? And I've been talking about the drag queen story hour, and that creeps me out. But just as let's be consistent, apply the same standards. If it's a clown or a rodeo thing or a petting zoo or whatever, everybody who has close contact to children should be screened. Let's not be stupid. Let's not be foolish about it. But let's not give people a pass because they're part of a protected class or a currently in vogue class. Just because drag queens are a thing, let's not give them a pass and create an opportunity, a path for pedophiles to get at kids. Because just like Willie Sutton robbed banks because that's where the money was, pedophiles will go where the kids are. And if they have to dress up and drag, so be it.
Yeah, I didn't want to get into the subject right now, but since this is a related topic, but I'm not so much concerned about what's going on in the secular world, because it kind of is what it is. But I well, no, I shouldn't say that. I mean, I am, but what goes on in religion seems so much more nefarious, because they use God as an accomplice.
Right.
And what I see, and I'll just use him as an example, because he's the most well known, is like somebody like James Martin, the Jesuit, who talks a lot about sexual orientation and gender identity, specifically having these discussions with children in a religious context, in a church with a priest, or with some other, someone affiliated with the Catholic Church. And I'm like, no. I mean, no, I don't think anybody has that right to talk to a child about their sexuality except their parents.
Well,
But
I certainly agree with the parent stuff. Well, and I'm generally supportive of Father Martin, although here's one of the problems, is that he won't talk about survivors for whatever reason. He's following the order to stay silent. Maybe it's because Dolan is in his backyard, so someone's told him to not engage with survivors, because that could cause, and not engage with me, because that could bring Dolan into question.
I've had to try to have a discussion with him, and you're correct. See, I'm not supportive, because he has specifically said that in a Catholic context, priests or educators should have these discussions. Children, and I'm like, no, you're not.
That sounds like a gateway. That sounds like a gateway into.
I say
abuse.
they never had that right. But after the priest sex abuse scandal, you forfeited that forever.
Right.
So you're not,
even if it might have made sense at some point. Just nope. No.
And I've been to the LA REC, the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress, where they were recommending that priests and teachers have these conversations with kids. And I mean, they even went as far as how to recognize vulnerable children. And I was like, this sounds like a blueprint for a predator.
Well, and I will say, I am generally LGBT positive. I'm a little concerned. I don't want to enable people, but I know for a fact that pedophiles are trying to get in to society under the LGBTQ plus. That's where the plus is, where the pedophiles are trying to get in.
Yep.
That's a fact. That's Prostasia. The Prostasia Foundation is trying to assimilate pedophilia under the plus in LGBTQ plus. That's a fact.
I agree. But what you just said there, would be considered, homophobic, because I've tried to have this conversation too.
It's not homophobic. It's a fact.
But they won't. They won't discuss it. They won't, because I've tried to have that conversation, and they won't have it. They just feel it's homophobic. So it's like it's the same kind of denial that you see in the Catholic Church. It's protecting the organization or the movement above anything.
Well, and it's enabling, and there's orthodoxy, and you can't question the orthodoxy. So how's that any different than the Catholic Church and the Catholic sex abuse crisis? And that's one of the reasons I'm trying to be really open about this stuff, even though it's not politically correct. And I have credibility. I'm not. Well, I know you could argue that I'm queer, so I've got 4 kids, and I was married, and I like women and that kind of stuff, but I have some queer-ish kind of stuff. So I have some credibility, and I'm trying to expend that credibility in this, because there are aspects of the present moment that really concern me. There's a lot of enabling. There's not enough thinking going on. There are pedophiles trying to get into things using banners, and it's just, it's the 70s all over again. And remember what happened. One of the reasons the 70s happened is because the 60s happened, and you had people like Foucault, who was a pedophile, were trying to change the norms about stuff, and they were successful in changing the norms, which sets things up for pedophiles. And it's all happening again. Nobody's learning from the 70s.
No, and I didn't want to broach this subject with you, but since you did, is it I don't have any credit either, because I've been called homophobic and having internalized homophobia. But I mean, I've tried to have this conversation too. Is it what I experienced, and I saw a lot of young guys experience it too? Is it, I came to the gay male community, pretty broken and an abuse survivor, and I found a lot of grooming there, because
Right.
the first men that would hit on me were older men.
Well, that's like the whole twink thing. The twink thing creeps me out.
Of course, I felt that they were cared about me, and some of them actually did, but
Right.
some of them actually just want to use you for
It's just exploitation all over again.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that happens to everybody,
right.
but it does happen to some people, and I don't see that the LGBT activists want to address it. That
right.
there's
it's not a politically acceptable conversation, which is a problem.
Yeah, that there's exploitation taking place in their own community, and it is what it is. So,
right.
I wanted to talk to you too. I wanted to dig a little deeper in this, because you talked about, I wrote it down. When God is used as an accomplice in the sexual abuse, because you talked,
or as a battering ram, as happened this weekend.
I don't know. That's just rude. And you talked about that because that's a reoccurring theme in a lot of stories too, where a child or even a vulnerable adult's own faith is used against them.
Right.
That is hard to wrap my mind around, but it happened to me too, because the priest that abused me was telling me all this stuff about how God wanted this and God had wanted that, and I believed it.
Well, and if you read the Pillar Catholic articles about what happened in Knoxville, the attack on the organist in Knoxville, and then you read the lawsuit filed by the organist in Knoxville, that kind of rationalization is used and is cited in the lawsuit, where, Christ made a sacrifice for his church, so you as a child should be making a sacrifice to me because I'm acting in persona Christi. So when I rape you, it's like Christ raping you.
I can't hear it. I can't hear it.
But that's written down in the complaint regarding the Knoxville lawsuit. That justification is there, and you can see it. All right. So where did this predator seminarian get this from? Did he get it from Bishop Sticca? And where did Bishop Sticca get it from? And then that rolls up to St. Louis. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do, is get people to roll from Sticca and Knoxville up to St. Louis, up to New York. And really, I think it rolls to Rome. How can it not roll to Rome ultimately?
Of course. And that's why I'm concerned right now, and I won't beat this dead horse anymore, but that's why I'm particularly concerned about priests talking about people in terms of their sexuality, God making you that way. I feel like no, you're, because that maybe I'm very sensitive to that, because that was the line used on me. Right. But I hear it a lot, and I don't like priests mixing sexuality and religion and all of this. I mean, it has a place, but I don't think it's with children.
No, I certainly agree that it's not, if you want to talk about that in high school or even with a 7th grader, that's one thing. The concern I have is that stuff is creeping younger and younger and younger. And while I think there's a lot of homo hysteria out there, I do think, as a parent, I raised 4 kids, and there's a time and place for stuff. And I don't think kindergarten is the appropriate time or place.
Yeah, I still believe that the Catholic Church has forfeited any right to have any kind of conversations with kid about
I agree,
sexuality.
because there's too much risk. There hasn't been enough cleaning up. There hasn't been the denazification of the hierarchy. Who the hell knows what the motivation is and where it's going to lead?
Too much history there.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, and then the other thing that fascinates me too, or I shouldn't say fascinates me, but about your case is, yeah, the the lines that are drawn. Um, you mentioned um, Cardinal Dolan,
All right.
and then Cardinal Regali, who,
Right. So Regali was in charge in 2002, and Dolan was working for Regali in 2002 when all the spotlight stuff hit. And when I went to Dolan in early March 2002, that was under Regali.
yeah, this is kind of a point that I've tried to make. I mean, I'm no longer Catholic, Roman Catholic anymore, but I
Yeah,
used to.
I say I've got my pinky toe in the church in large part because of a couple of things, but pinky toe's it.
I haven't an atom in the church, nothing. And but when I was Catholic, uh, um, I kind of exiled myself, or sought protection, in very traditional Catholic circles. And Cardinal Regali was definitely
Right.
very, very
And that's one of the concerns I have,
esteemed.
because he seems I have some sense of him, both him and Burke. Essentially Regali handed off to Burke, and they play the traditionalist thing. Well, and even Dolan was, and that's one of the things about Immaculata is Immaculata was a very traditional place. We went to mass 6 days a week. So a lot of these people who want to retreat and think there's refuge in traditionalism, I'm
Yeah,
like, that's we were very traditional, we were very orthodox, and kids were being abused in the sacristy every week.
yeah, and then of course
Don't be foolish about this stuff. And I really do believe that this is Satan. We've traced the call, and Satan is calling from inside the hierarchy.
I, I agree. And then the other one you mentioned was Cardinal Burke, who
Right.
I actually got to meet once, and he's very highly esteemed within traditional circles. And I want your opinion. Well, you've already kind of given it, but
Well, here's what I know about Burke.
okay,
So my abuser was removed at the end of March 2002. So I came forward at the beginning of March 2002. I have a document that proves that another guy came forward in early March 2002. And then I know a third guy who came forward in late March 2002, which basically forced the hands of Dolan and Regali and forced them to basically, they canned my abuser. And the worst part is they cut him loose to live unsecured and unsupervised in a private residence. I've heard that it was his mom's house. Now, the problem with Cardinal Burke is that Cardinal Burke continued that policy for some period of time of just cutting my abuser loose. At some point, they pulled my abuser back in and had him live at the Regina Clary, which is kind of the retired priest's home. But even so, there's the question of, that's not a prison. What kind of restrictions was he under? So people want to talk to me about how Cardinal Burke is the solution, and all I know is Cardinal Burke did not do a great job of handling the case of my abuser. That's all I know.
yeah, and here on the West Coast, we had a lot of foreign-born Irish priests, and what the bishops did here was send them back to Ireland.
Right.
So
Yeah, the shuffle, it's, they're just playing the same game.
yeah. So
I don't see any fundamental change there.
no, not at all. So I think you've already given your opinion on this, but I tried to make the point that the sex abuse problem in the Catholic Church is not a left or right problem. It's not a liberal or conservative problem. It affects the entire institution. And I learned that the hard way, because I was abused by a rather, I guess you would call him a leftist or liberal priest. And then later I went to work for a group of very conservative priests said the Latin Mass, and by like a traditional way of thinking of things, they like checked all the boxes, Catholic, everything, and they were predators.
Right.
So I had to like go, what the, you know, this is institutional.
Right.
It's not just bad priest, good priest, bad bishop, good bishop. I, they're all
it's not the apples, it's the barrel.
That's good. I like that.
Right.
Holy smokes. Yeah, it's just, and I think when you realize that, I mean, when I left the church, because one of my abusers was a Jesuit, like you mentioned the Jesuits, and I was like, because I always, in my mind, I was always like, well, the Jesuits are bad and they promote a lot of this stuff that I consider grooming, and they've, one of the worst cases was in 2019. I remember it was a Catholic boys, I think it was a boys' school in New York City, and when the survivors had sued the school and the Jesuits had tried to dox their names, and I was like, oh, this is really bad.
The Jesuits are no better than the mainline Catholics. They're just as nasty.
I think they're worse because they have a lot of money, but yeah. And I was kind of like, well, if it's just the Jesuits, I guess the rest of the church is okay. But then I'm like, well, the Pope is a Jesuit, and then all that stuff came out about him and McCarrick, and I was like, I can't do this anymore.
Right, the whole thing.
I'm like bifurcating so many times. We're like, okay. And then I did like the SSPX thing for a while. And then I think Church Militant, they got a lot of heat for that. But I knew one of the victims in that case. And I was like, this is all true. There's like nowhere to go except out.
Right. Well, and let me make clear, I'm still a Christian. In some ways, I'm actually a stronger Christian than ever before, because I completely relate to Jesus Christ and what he went through on the cross. And as much of as painful as it is to have the Archdiocese of St. Louis bull rush me with the Blessed Sacrament and try to bull me out of the way, it's nothing compared to hanging from a cross.
I watched that, and I'll link your Twitter account to this video, because that's, I think, the best way for people to follow you, is that because I haven't really done that like you did with the sign, but like where I live in San Francisco, I've gone.
Well, and to be clear, my sign said survivors need help.
No, it was nice.
It didn't say F the church or anything like that. It said survivors need help.
No, but yeah, so I've gone, because it's bizarre, because the church hierarchy kind of hangs its hat on being so welcoming and open to survivors and victims, and they set up all these boards, or I don't know, these help.
In Vos Estis Lux Mundi, the Pope passed a law, which was a complete sham and a fraud.
But they won't talk to you if you try to. So I used to go to places where, it sounds like I'm stalking him, but I guess I was. I used to go, but this is what you got to do. Is I used to go to places where Archbishop Corleone would be, because I wanted to talk to him like an ordination or something. And yeah, you're not treated well. So when I saw that video with you, I was like, did anybody, because I'm sure they knew you were there, did anybody come out and say, is there anything we can do to help? No. Or
well, kind of the worst part for me. So just so they bull rush me and they just try to blow me out of the way. And it's the rector who really does things. And the seminarians, to their credit, the seminarians were just going to kind of veer off and veer around me. No big deal. It was the rector of the Cathedral Basilica who was like, screw that, we're going right through this guy. So he actually grabs one of the seminarians and pulls him back online. And it's interesting. And I really feel bad for the seminarians, because they're being manhandled, and you can see the looks come across their face where they're like, what WTF, dude? Why are you doing this? And to a degree, I'm trying to make the point and point out the contrast to the seminarians and say, okay, guys, go into this with your eyes open. Now my point to people is, I don't want you to leave. I want you to stay and fight. but if you're going to go in, I want you to go in with your eyes wide open. And it's really kind of terrifying that they will do that stuff out in the open. They will, I mean, I consider what they did abuse of those seminarians, and that they will abuse those seminarians out in the open, knowing that I'm videotaping the whole freaking thing.
What they're doing is what you described as testing, because I went over this with Gene Gomulka, and because I don't have much church hope for the future of the Catholic Church, because
same 1/10 of 1% is my likelihood that things are going to get better.
Yeah. So the type of grooming that takes place between a predator and their victim is the same sort of scenario that takes place in seminaries. Because right. I mean, I've known a lot of seminarians. I don't anymore, but because I used to be very involved with the church. But I could tell that certain seminarians are zeroed out as being very complicit and very easily. I guess they call it. Well, I'd say it's groomed. But they can,
and those are the guys who are put on the bishop track because they got what it takes.
They can be formed, and then the ones that are pushed up against, the institution are, oh, got to get rid of this one. And
those are the Father Mark Whites. And my concern, and to make a point about Father Mark and Father James Martin, Father Mark White is the Father James Martin of survivors. Why isn't Father Mark White being invited to meet with the Pope as Father James Martin was? I actually, I'm more friendly. I'm trying not to be too enabling about that stuff, but I didn't have a problem with Father Martin being invited to meet with the Pope. My problem is, why isn't Father Mark White, who's trying to do the same thing for survivors, being invited and being given the same consideration? Instead, Father Mark White is a pariah. I don't get the contrast there. I don't get the difference there.
Yeah. Because
Matthew 7:5, people.
Because Martin has a lot of powerful friends.
Right.
And Father White has a lot of powerful enemies. That's the difference. That's the difference.
Right. Well, and part of the thing with Martin, and this goes to Father Zollner, and this goes to Cardinal O'Malley, they're willing to keep their mouths shut about certain things. And that's really kind of the concerning thing for me is, I was communicating with Father Zollner up to the sex abuse crisis, and then he cut me off. I was communicating with Cardinal O'Malley up to the sex abuse crisis, and then he cut me off.
Who's Zollner?
Zollner is the head of the child and youth protection stuff at the Vatican. And Cardinal O'Malley is basically the Pope's right-hand man on abuse in the Vatican. I've gone to both of them. They were both communicating with me. They've both ceased communicating with me, which, to use a Nazi phrase, is maybe they were just following orders. Maybe they were ordered to break off communication with me. But what kind of a person follows that order? You don't have to follow an illegal or immoral order, which is a point I made with respect to Father Mark White. I think Father Mark White is acting justly in refusing to follow an immoral, if not illegal, per canon law order.
I interviewed him, and it was heartbreaking because the one thing that the bishop demanded that he do is take down his website that I had really looked at thoroughly before I interviewed him, and there's nothing there that should have to be taken down.
Yeah, he's not enabling the church, but he's also not saying anything inappropriate. He's just speaking the truth.
And there's a priest that wants to be a priest, wants to stay a priest,
right? And
he's just telling the truth, but they still want to get rid of him and shut him up. So that's where I don't want to lay anything at his doorstep, but that was just a combination of things I know another priest that had a similar story, although it never became publicly known. But priests that try to do the right thing when they see abuse or predation or grooming are kicked out, or they're persecuted.
Right.
And
They're kicking out the wrong guys. They're kicking out the good guys, not the bad guys. And that's happened to me over and over again in St. Louis, where I know some of the seminarians and I've talked to them, and I keep waiting for this guy to get ordained, and he never gets ordained, and it's because he bailed out.
yeah,
And the guys who make it through are the ass kissers and the guys who are willing to enable.
yeah, they
And
still
the guys who are willing to just follow orders. And that is a hearkening back to a Nazi term, but that's exactly what this is.
yeah, you're right. They still protect the predators, and they punish the whistleblower. And I'm talking about priests here.
Yep.
And that's not good. And
that doesn't sound like Jesus. That sounds like the other guy.
yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of, because I had a discussion about this with someone from SNAP, and because I was particularly interested in Hispanic Catholics, and because I think the Catholic Church, at least in the United States, definitely in Europe, has lost sort of the native-born population. I think they've wised up. I think they know they're money grubbers, right. And I think they know that there's just a lot of predation and abuse. So I think they've checked out, right, of religion, or they've moved on. But I worry about recent immigrants to, right, the United States, because when I've gotten really sad emails, it's usually from a mom. They're like first generation or immigrants. Like I remember.
Well, and that's exactly what's going on in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, with the case of Father Anthony Punakal, who's preying upon Honduran, Mexican, Central American immigrants.
Because there still is a trust factor there, because I remember a mom wrote me an email and said that her son was having some issues. I don't think dad was in the picture, but like the case that, I mean, it sends chills up my spine, but she kind of handed him over to the parish priest for help, and he got abused. Right. And I'm like, I don't know, that nothing, I don't think anything has changed. Right. The church has just brought in new victims.
Yeah. No, and they're new abusers. You know, they're running out of abusers in the States, so they're bringing them in from India and Africa, and you know, these guys are, you know, they don't want to go back home to Africa or Central America, so they'll just do whatever they're told to do.
Well, what? Because I'm curious about this too, is that because I've tried to interview survivors. I think the common thread through the survivors that I've spoken to is they're all people that, it sounds like a cliche, but they've risen above the abuse of their past, and they've tried to do something good to help others. Because people don't realize, I think a lot of people think that all pre-sex abuse survivors become activists,
right?
Oh, and they're all out there, you know, pushing.
Well, and just let me give you a number just so people understand in terms of the magnitude. My abuser may have gotten 100 guys at Immaculata. I'm the only one of those 100 who's public. He may have gotten 1,000 guys in St. Louis. There are only 2 of us who are public out of that 1,000.
Yeah. So, yeah. So I guess my point is that people who have been, and not just by priests, but people that have been sexually abused, right, a lot of times are never recover. They're completely devastated. There's people with serious mental illness. There's people that fall into drug addictions. and homelessness. And a lot of people that went through this are not even here. They killed themselves.
No, I know their names, you know.
And so not all survivors are speaking out. So I'm interested in how how the early trauma in your life, it didn't completely devastated you. I mean, did God play a part in that? Did family, friends? You talked about therapy, and I've certainly partaken in that. So
Yeah,
what?
I mean, part of it is I've seen like 15 therapists. I've had to pay for that all myself. The Archdiocese of St. Louis won't pay for anything. It's all a lie. I've spent tens of thousands of dollars of therapy. Uh, I did have 4 kids, which is very distracting, which is one of the reasons why I made it as far as I did before I got sick. But as soon as my kids started, especially my boys, started passing through the age that I was, that's when I got sick and had kind of a nervous breakdown. Uh, I did have a fairly deep faith, and to a degree, I conceptualize this as a religious battle. I really do believe that this is Satan. Uh, I believe that I am fighting Satan. I am a Christian in a lot of ways, a stronger Christian in some ways, and I just see Satan as targeting the Catholic Church, just as he will target any church, just as he's targeted the SBC. Satan will go where the power is and where the opportunities for influence are. That's, I wasn't always like this. I almost, well, to a degree, one of the reasons I had the nervous breakdown is I started to get back into the church through some of the kind of the more traditionalist stuff, which just triggered the hell out of me. But I ended up surviving this with kind of at least my faith in Jesus Christ intact. But I really view myself as being in kind of a spiritual battle with Satan. I've had a few kind of interesting coincidences happen that have made me wonder if I am being guided. Accompaniments, just really interesting coincidences that with the idea being that if God is trying to tell me something, I'm not going to turn my back on God. I don't know whether it's God or not, but if it is God, I'm going to do something about it. And it really does seem like a righteous act, regardless of whether you do it with God in mind or not. Protecting kids, well, that just seems like the right thing to do, period. Whether you believe in karma or Christ or whatever. How do you not protect a kid? How can you not protect a kid given that you know what I know? How do you leave kids? I refuse to allow what happened to me to happen to anyone else. I will be damned if I allow what happened to me to anyone else to happen to anyone else. And I believe that both literally and metaphorically.
Yeah, you're in the fight, and I had to walk away because it was driving me crazy.
And I'll never begrudge a survivor doing what they need to do to survive. Your first job is to survive.
But how does it not drive you crazy? Because
well, you're assuming that it's not driving me crazy, and it is to a degree because I fight it all the time. I still have these compulsions. I'm better at hiding them than some other people are. I still struggle with a lot of stuff.
Because sometimes your Twitter account can be triggering to me because I see it's like this guy's always in it, and I'm like,
well, but there is a level of obsessiveness there. Some of it is unhealthy. Some of it has damaged my relationship with my kids, although to a degree it's also made possible by the fact that the church has ruined my relationship with my kids. So what the hell else am I supposed to do? My kids won't talk to me. So
I'm so sorry, but I think the church needs people like you.
Right. And I think and I agree with that. And that's why I'm doing it. I do feel called to do this.
Who are relentless, because I think there's not many people that can do it. I can't do it. I mean, I've had survivors who just have the most incredible stories of suffering and triumph and redemption, but they will not share it. Right. They will not.
Well, and I'm trying to model it for people. I'm trying to make it possible for others to do it by showing that it's possible.
Right. And that's why I think the church needs people like you. thank God that you're doing it, because if, like, a lot of times I see you as the lone person out there, so it's like
I feel like it. I
well,
certainly
no,
feel like
you
it.
are literally, you're literally the only person standing there. And I'm like, well, if he's not there, then who's going to be there? Well, nobody.
Right.
So no matter what your faith is, I ask people listening to pray, for Chris and other survivors like him who are really out there in the front lines, because I think the hierarchy wants everyone to forget
Absolutely.
as quickly as possible.
Absolutely.
And I think they want them to forget. And I think they want them to not know that really nothing has changed. I think, if anything, the abuse crisis is worse in the Catholic Church than it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
No, I agree. I agree with that completely.
So yeah, thank you so much, Chris. Hey, God bless you, and God give you strength.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's good.